Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Painting out of 4 buckets today. There's a lot going on around here. Presidential debates, primary results, an Israel vote in the House today, and, of course, CPI Day. We're going to knock down all of these stories with some of the smartest minds in politics and economics over the next hour. And glad you're with us as we begin with data this morning at 8:30. Suddenly everyone feeling pretty good about things as I read the headline on the terminal. U.S. inflation ebbs for first time in 6 months in relief for Fed. This is the headline that so many have been hoping for. But let's look under the hood because the headline does not always tell the whole story. Mark Hamrick joins us now. Bankrate Washington bureau chief with his take on this. Mark, it's good to have you back. Is the euphoria justified?
It's good to be with you, Joe. I think David Kailey summed that up well in the earlier soundbite in the sense that we did not suffer another negative surprise here. And so just to have things show up essentially in line with expectations feels like a moral victory. But as we sort of think about this battle against inflation, the battle continues, and we cannot say that victory is declared, but you'll take the wins when you can get them. And of course, you know, if we're thinking about the prospect of a rate hike around September, there's a heck of a lot of things that need to happen between now and then, including statistical data releases.
Yeah. Now, you meant hike or cut because people have been talking about both, Mark.
Well, Chairman Powell is not talking about a rate hike, and so I think we probably need to follow his lead on that unless we get some truly remarkable surprise. And so we're talking about a rate cut. And, you know, I think that as we've either been part of these discussions, Joe, or listened to them more broadly, I think part of this is trying to keep some things in perspective. And part of that also is to acknowledge high degrees of uncertainty between then and now. The world can change quickly. The other part is that higher for longer, which is sort of the baseline expectation for interest rates these days, can persist beyond the first rate cut. So what is the destination? And we'll have a better idea about that, you know, as we move along that journey as well. Another way of saying that compared to what happened before the pandemic, it's probably a good expectation. In other words, a smart expectation or assumption to say that rates will remain elevated for the foreseeable future, but just not as high as they have been or are right now.
Spending time with Mark Hamrick at Bankrate. We're going to have to start seeing 0.2, right? Maybe 0.1. We got to start getting down to lower numbers here before we can have a real conversation about rate cuts, right? We're celebrating 0.3 instead of 0.4, but these need to start going lower.
They do, if only to sort of meet the Federal Reserve's expectations for its preferred inflation gauge, personal consumption expenditures and core. And so could that happen? Sure. I think that, you know, as was mentioned earlier, as we see consumer spending moderate, as we see consumers saying no to a lot of prospective purchases, trading down where they are accepting the terms of those purchases, and in the marketplace, perhaps setting prices at lower levels. I think we're seeing some weakness now in automobile sales, which are showing up on dealer lots. You know, they have essentially a couple of ways to respond to that, including price. Affordability is really, you know, the other watchword of our day, because we talk about inflation being this dynamic that's been present for more than 2 years in a significant way. But affordability, or lack thereof, is really the end result of that. And that's the thing that so many people are struggling against.
Really interesting to hear some of the anecdotal evidence as well from earnings reporting season, Mark. And I know this doesn't qualify as data for someone like yourself, but when you hear Starbucks talking about people trading down or not buying that expensive cup of coffee the way they were a couple of months ago. When you hear McDonald's in that same reporting season say the same thing, they're trying to work on a $5 value meal to keep people coming into the restaurant. How do you add that to the composite of data that's going to prompt the Fed one way or the other?
Well, it's color, right? And I think, these are data points. They're not government, statistical data, but they are data points. And I literally did write down that $5 meal thing on my sort of omnibus notepad this morning, because I think that's sort of how this is presenting itself. If you can't get people to pay, let's say, $9 per meal at a McDonald's, then you have to adjust because ultimately, unless we're on the road, these are discretionary purchases, right? In other words, you do not have to go get that $4.25 cup of coffee that you could make at home for significantly less than that. And that's where it becomes almost a luxury. And I think that's where consumers are drawing their own lines on that. I've done it in the past several days myself, where we had Mother's Day last weekend. I opted against the beef to put on the grill, went for the chicken instead. And, I was more satisfied with the latter purchase than I would have been with the former.
I get that. I don't know. Next year, maybe take mom for the $5 value meal. I think that's.
We'll see how that goes over.
It's good to have you back. Mark Hamrick with his instant read on CPI. The Bankrate Washington bureau chief with us here on Balance of Power. We'll hit this data as we work through the program, if only in our market checks. This is going over real well on Wall Street, and Charlie Pellet will breathe some life into that for us a little bit later on. As I mentioned, 4 buckets we're painting out of today. We just went through one with CPI. The other is a looming vote today in the House on a piece of legislation, a resolution that will essentially call everyone on the carpet when it comes to our policy in Israel. This follows, of course, you remember we had a lot of talk about this last week, Joe Biden's decision to withhold some weapons shipments from Israel. That prompted the Speaker of the House and Republican leadership to bring this resolution to the floor to compel the president to continue supporting Israel. And the whipping right now is looking interesting. We're hearing that as many as 30 or 40 Democrats could break away from the White House to vote for this resolution. Everybody's trying to cover themselves here in an election cycle. So we talk about the policy in Israel. There's also big news coming out of Ukraine, and that's why we wanted to spend some time with Michael Allen, who's just made his way across town from Beacon Global Strategies. It's great to see you, sir. Welcome back to Bloomberg. You, of course, former special assistant to the president, former senior director, counterproliferation strategy, National Security Council. Your experience is important to us here. Let's start with Israel right now, because I'm having a hard time telling what's going on. Last week, we're telling everybody about these 2,000-pound bombs that the president was withholding. But the headline this morning is he's working up a new billion-dollar weapons package, even as this vote takes place, to essentially condemn his decision last week. How do you rationalize all of these at once?
So it's very confusing. I mean, it even goes back farther. We just appropriated another $14 billion to go to Israel, and we say act in your own self-defense, but yet we're saying with the other hand, we're going to deny you some arms. It's especially confusing this week, though. I think the real answer is a boring bureaucratic answer, that some of these things have been in the pipeline. And there are multiple times for Congress and the administration to sort of say these things are ready to go. But it must infuriate them from a strategic messaging standpoint, because it looks like they're trying to, on the one hand, limit what Bibi's doing in Rafah by saying no more offensive weapons, while reassuring everyone, well, there's more long-term stuff on the way. So it's really confusing, and I wouldn't blame anybody for trying to say, what is the Biden policy?
Well, I'll tell you, interesting insights from General David Petraeus, retired general, back from the Qatar Economic Forum, where he sat down with our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, to talk about what it is to go after Hamas, remembering, of course, his experience in the Middle East fighting the Taliban. Here's what he told Bloomberg earlier today. Let's listen.
You have to clear and hold and keep the enemy out of the people. And I do believe, by the way, that Hamas is the equivalent of the Islamic State. This is an irreconcilable extremist group that I believe does need to be destroyed. But how you do that matters a great deal. And I would welcome seeing a commitment that we are going to make your lives better, civilians in Gaza.
Michael, I'd love your take on that. Do you see Hamas as the equivalent of the Islamic State? Is Israel essentially fighting ISIS? Does that go for Hezbollah to the north as well?
I think I do agree with him, and I agree that both Hezbollah and Hamas are rejectionist groups. They're irreconcilable. There's no way to bring them over into a more moderate camp, if you will. I was in Israel last week. The issues are just as you think. Netanyahu cannot say anything about a post-Gaza situation because he would lose the right wing of his governing coalition in the Knesset. So he is restrained in saying things like he's saying today of, oh, well, I can't talk about this until the whole thing is over. But yeah, I think even though the Israeli society is racked with concerns about the hostages, they generally agree we need to destroy Hamas, at the very least the 4 battalions who are in the Rafah area, and then we can begin to see our way through the end of this phase of the war.
You were there last week.
Yeah.
How did people react when they were talking with somebody fresh out of Washington here? Did you get an earful on this? Did they want to talk to you about the protests in America? What was the conversation?
They were very concerned. They're very concerned about the growth and explosion, frankly, of anti-Semitism. They are, though, trying to plead with us and say, after September 11th, you wouldn't have agreed to anyone trying to restrict your freedom of action. Why is Biden trying to do this to us? The thing I think, though, that is the most concerning for them is the idea that over time we would cut them off from arms and assistance. On the one hand, they want to say, listen, we're going to do this ourselves. But on the other hand, Netanyahu cannot sacrifice, in the end, his relationship with the United States. That is the greatest asset, arguably, that Israel has, at least national security-wise. So we may not be able to talk him out of going into Rafah, but if he's thinking about going into Hezbollah before the election, I really don't think the relationship with Israel and the United States will survive that.
That's saying a lot, because a lot of people think that's about to happen.
Yeah,
I need to ask you, Michael, about Ukraine. Troubling, if you're concerned about the future of Ukraine, troubling reporting in the New York Times today that would suggest we are at an inflection point that could be the turn upon which Ukraine really starts losing this battle. 18 months ago, White House and Pentagon officials, as we're reminded, were debating whether Russia was about to collapse. Russia is making a serious move right now. Ukraine is asking for weapons, a Patriot battery for Kharkiv, where Russia is making quite a bit of headway here. But to see the side effect of a months-long debate actually show itself on the battlefield like this is troubling a lot of U.S. officials. What's the real situation on the ground?
It's alarming. The Ukrainians are losing villages. The Russians are exploiting what their strengths are, which are manpower and industrial might, and throwing everything they can at the Ukrainians now. With the Ukrainians got a morale boost out of the fact that on April 20th we did the Ukrainian aid, but not all of that, not even a small portion of that has come online yet. So I don't know that they're enjoying the benefits of what they might in another month or two. But they're trying to hold on.
Yeah.
The Battle of Kharkiv, as you mentioned, has begun. I think the Russians don't have enough troops. They don't have it sized correctly to take the entire city. But it's touch and go, and things are going to get worse before they get better for Ukraine.
Well, okay. But that also would suggest there's time for Ukraine to turn this around.
Yes. Because Russia, at the end of the day, still doesn't have the right strategy or the right leadership, I think, to do a sustained breakthrough in Ukraine. They may win villages. They may make some progress here and there. It is going to be alarming and seem alarming. But for them to break through, for example, like the Ukrainians did when they took Kharkiv,
right? Yes,
or Kherson in 2022, I don't think you're going to see anything that dramatic, but wow, that would cause a panic.
Well, your perspective is important here, because I'm hearing too little too late.
Yeah.
You don't agree with that?
I think it came just in time, but barely.
Yeah.
I mean, The hard part, of course, is getting all this stuff over there and getting it online. There are obviously munitions, backlogs, and all sorts of
with
other
a lot
things.
more to deliver.
I think they'll hold on, but it's going to be touch and go.
And a lot more to manufacture as well in that $60 billion tranche. Michael, it's great to see you. Michael Allen from Beacon Global Strategies helping us walk through the news today on the geopolitical front.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
It's not just CPI day. This is also a day where we got news not just on inflation, but on presidential debates. Will be happening between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. The first will be on June 27th in Atlanta, the swing state of Georgia. And that is where we go in our next conversation. I'm pleased to say that joining us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio is Dr. Bernice King. She's the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. and the CEO of the King Center, joining us from our Atlanta bureau. Dr. King, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time. As we look ahead to what will go down in Atlanta just over a month from now, it comes against a backdrop of polls suggesting, including a New York Times Siena poll just earlier this week, that not only is Donald Trump leading in swing states, including Georgia, 20% of black voters is the tally he's winning right now. That would be the highest for any Republican presidential candidate since the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What exactly do you see happening here? Why is support shifting?
Well, I think when people feel like they are not getting their issues heard or represented in a period of time, and there is a shift in the possibility of changing administrations or candidates, people have a tendency to shift parties or shift to other individuals who may be running in the same party. We saw that, as you know, in 2008 with President Obama, after President Bush. We saw that when Obama ran again. Some people who did not vote for him the first time voted for him the second time. Or people who did not vote for him, people who voted for President Bush, and this time around when Obama was running, did not vote in the Republican Party. They voted in the Democratic Party because they wanted hope, they wanted change. So I think there are people in the black community who are feeling like not a lot has changed, especially economically, in the black community, and I think many of them have been driven by that.
Dr. King, it's great to have you with us, and I appreciate the time that you're giving us today from Atlanta. We were in Atlanta for the Senate runoff that reestablished Raphael Warnock as the senator from Georgia, and I had the opportunity to walk around the King Center, spent time walking past that beautiful reflecting pool, and the people we spoke with that day talked about Joe Biden and Democrats, what they could do to help Georgia. Raphael Warnock, of course, was a big part of that conversation, and we're having a very different conversation at this point now. But you're there. What are you actually hearing from people? Do you believe these polls? Do you believe that Donald Trump is going to secure the black vote in 2024?
I don't know if it's a matter of a belief. I think there are many people concerned that could be the case. And it's not speculation. I mean, especially black males who seem to be more attracted to Donald Trump and his candidacy. And I think there has to be a plan and a strategy for the Biden administration to really creatively figure out how to reach, especially this next generation who's very disgruntled right now. With the Biden administration. It's not going to be easy, unfortunately, but this probably is the most defining election of my time. You know, I've been here 61 years. I've been, voting for 45, somewhere around there, 44 years. So, it's an important election. And people have to be very thoughtful about how they want to see our nation move forward in the coming years and who is going to best represent that policy-wise and tone and tenor-wise, because it all goes together. Presidents set a tone in a nation, and that is, to me, just as important as the policy side. As we know, most of the policies are passed by Congress. They're running as well this year. So it has to be very thoughtful in the approach. And I'm not sure many people are being thoughtful at this time. Typically, people are led by, emotion. And we also have to be thoughtful globally. It can't just be about me, because I live collectively in community. It's about my neighbors. So I have to think about it holistically, about who would best represent us holistically as a nation, and also those very fundamental issues that affect the least among us.
Well, as we consider the issues, and knowing that President Biden himself will actually be down in Georgia this weekend giving the commencement address at Morehouse, we have seen a lot of turmoil on college campuses lately. The issue of Israel and the ongoing war in Gaza is definitely one that seems to be shaping this election cycle, and especially given you and your family's legacy of peaceful protests. What do you make of what we have seen on campuses across the country that have not always been peaceful, and in fact, in many instances, have turned violent?
Well, I think in all fairness, it has to be a balanced approach in how we talk about it. As with any protest, any movement, there's going to be people who infiltrate. It happened with my father. The difference, I think, in today's time is because there's not a real strategy that people are organizing around collectively with parameters and criteria. It's very difficult in a world where people can get information instantly to have those kind of regulations, but you have to, because otherwise what becomes a story is what you're saying. My father was able to guard against that. As you know, in Memphis, they had to pull him out right before he was assassinated. Shortly before he was assassinated, he led a protest there, and some people that infiltrated to turn it violent. And he had a track record of nonviolence, and that's important as well as we approach these. So yes, that is true that there have been some, but I do want to applaud the young people who have not been violent, the ones who have been trying to press the message about what's happening to the Palestinians, and those who are pressing the message about Palestinians and freeing the hostages, because all of this is getting lost, because I think there are people out there who genuinely want a holistic approach to what's happening, and they want something that's humane and the saving of lives, period. And so that's not getting to the surface. And so I do not support the violence because I come from a place of nonviolence, but I do know that there are people out there who do have a posture of trying to do this in a peaceful way. And unfortunately, when people feel like their demands are not being heard, it often happens. That's when Daddy said you get the violence is the language of the unheard. So we have to look at why is this happening as well.
It's an awfully important line right now. Dr. King, Kailey mentions the speech at Morehouse, the commencement address by President Biden. That's not all we have on the schedule this week. On Thursday, tomorrow, he'll be meeting with plaintiffs from Brown versus the Board of Education case and their families. On Friday, he's speaking at an NAACP event and will address members of the Little Rock Nine, a campaign event on Saturday in Atlanta, and then Morehouse on Sunday. Dr. King, does being present like this help?
Well, if being present is consistent, yes. It's very difficult if people perceive your presence as being more political. And I think that's what a lot of people who in elected office face. And that is, where are you in the middle, in the times in between? And I think people are experiencing that. They're showing up now, but what about those other times? Now, I'm not suggesting that that has not been the case with the administration. But if it is the case that you have been consistently present, then the messaging has to improve, and people need to know that you have, and those people who know you've been present need to be the voice saying, let me show you how they've been present. Here are the results. So the campaign can't speak. The people who have benefited from the administration, should I say, need to be speaking. Let me show you how this has impacted my life. This is what I have gotten from the Biden administration. So now is the time for the people who believe in this candidate, who believe in President Biden, because he's a candidate now, unfortunately. He's the president, but yet he's a candidate. So now the people who believe in what he's done as the president need to be speaking for him while he is the candidate and saying this is what he's done for our communities, our group, with these issues.
Only you could make the point in the way that you just did. Dr. King, we're delighted that you could come and talk to us today. Live from Atlanta, Dr. Bernice King, CEO of the King Center. Thank you for joining here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. Fascinating conversation, Kailey, as we spend so much time talking to strategists from here inside the Beltway. Obviously, the conventional wisdom inside the bubble is important when you're dealing with Congress and the White House. Yeah. But hearing a perspective like that would be awfully important for both campaigns right now.
Yeah, and the message from Dr. King there essentially is consistency is key. Yeah. Not just 1 week of events that ultimately will make a difference when voters in specific demographic groups are questioning whether or not your policies ultimately have catered to them or not.
Her words were carefully chosen there. I'll be curious to see his reception at these events this week.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
My eyes are looking out, Joe, to the 27th of June. My
plans?
Calendar is marked big red circle. First debate between Biden and Trump of the 2024 cycle
Atlanta,
is on.
It's going to be like a pin dropping in that room. Imagine no crowd.
Yeah.
No one's clapping, no cheering. Not that they're supposed to anyway, but this is what happens. And then they get their mics cut off when they go over time. It's going to be a surreal environment for these two.
Yeah, assuming that all those rules can be agreed to.
Fair enough.
When Donald Trump's indicating he would prefer something with a live audience, a bigger venue, maybe not wanting the mic to be clipped at any one time.
Yes, right.
So we'll see, I guess.
Again, assuming that everyone agrees to all of this. Let's see what the panel thinks. Rick Davis, of course, Bloomberg politics contributor, Republican strategist, has actually not only run presidential campaigns, but been deeply involved in this planning process that typically includes the Commission on Presidential Debates. He's with us alongside Brad Howard, Democratic strategist, founder of the Corcoran Street Group. Brad, I know you're feeling pretty good about the position that Joe Biden is in walking into this. But how worried are you about live fact-checking or just a Donald Trump who never cared about the rules anyway? Why would he start now?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously going to be a concern. We saw just how rattling it was when he did it to Hillary in 2016. The media was unprepared to hold him to account then. I think did better in 2020, but you're right. The combination of trying to hold him to account could envelop every single answer on that show. And I think there is some legitimate concern of, is it really the moderator's role to correct everything that they say? Should that be left up to the American people? So I think there's a reasonable happy medium there. I think the moderators that I'm sure CNN will choose will be, they have a great set a bench of experienced moderators. And so I trust these news organizations to handle it better probably than the commission here. So we'll look forward to it. And Joe, just to the point of your son getting his driver's license, where I'm from, our response to that would just be bless your heart. So good luck with that.
Bless your heart. All right. Well, Rick, come on in here, because obviously we have seen a debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden before in the 2020 cycle. We know how perhaps undignified at certain points it was to characterize it. How do you prep this go around for a debate between Donald Trump, who isn't always reluctant to stray from the truth, if you're Joe Biden, who tends to stick more to the truth?
Yeah, I think Joe Biden's going to have to really figure out a way to, distance himself from Trump, but also be really on alert, because I agree it's hard to fact check Donald Trump. But I mean, to some degree, that's going to be Biden's job. He can't just ignore factual misrepresentations coming from his opponent, because you can't rely on the moderators. CNN has a bad track record with Donald Trump. the much discussed town hall that CNN did during the campaign with Donald Trump turned into a lie fest, and they lost control of it. Donald Trump is a disruptive guy. He knows how to take control of these situations. He's got enough, capacity to really, be a disruptive force in something like a debate. And General Joe Biden. I mean, come on. I mean, he's a dignified guy who tries to play by the rules, even if there are no rules to be played by. And so I think that they're going to have to throw out the playbook with Joe Biden, force him to not think about debates the way he traditionally has. I mean, he's got 50 years of political experience debating on one set of rules, and this is a different time, a different place, and a different opponent. You've got to throw out that rule book and be ready to really go to town on Donald Trump, and have a firm grasp of the facts so that he can correct the record. Because if the record stands, he's going to look really bad.
I still have so many questions for both of you here, Brad, including who's going to watch. Nobody's going to mourn, I realize, the end or the death of the Commission on Presidential Debates, but there was a purpose here to not just have a presidential debate, for instance, on a single cable network. A lot of people won't even be able to watch that. We spend all day talking about cord cutting here, Brad. Are we going to lose something when the commission goes away?
I mean, possibly. It remains to be seen. I mean, there are ways that I imagine that these candidates will ensure that folks in their orbits will be able to watch. I think, as we've seen time and again, the first debate usually is a very highly watched affair. But you got to remember, the true thing that sway these debates is the spin afterwards. It's does a candidate give the other campaign a moment to really attack them with and run it in paid media over and over and over. So if Biden has a bad moment, if Trump has a bad moment, trust me, swing voters will see it in paid ads throughout the country. One has a good moment, another has a good moment. You'll see that in paid ads across the country. So they will get down, but the start to finish, kind of full broad spectrum, watching the debate. If you want to watch it, there will be ways to watch it. I'm sure there'll be watch parties and things on college campuses and et cetera. So I'm less concerned about that. I mean, the average viewer today is a little more savvy than they were probably 10 years ago. So there's an ability to find any program you want to watch these days.
This is going to raise the stakes, though, Kailey. In that world, everyone's just going for a moment.
Right. You're looking for a soundbite or whatever can go viral on TikTok, or assuming we still have it at that point. We should, right? Both campaigns are on it. But it's about what gets replayed over and over again the next day, which just underscores, Rick, how much of this, especially for two candidates who are the age that they are, this is about performance and being able to show stamina and dexterity and speak in your speech when you're ad-libbing, not necessarily reading off a teleprompter. Is this ultimately really going to be about policy, especially because these two candidates are so well known, as are a lot of their stances?
Kailey, that's a fair statement. What do people really take away from these? I was there at the debate when George Bush looked at his watch. George H.W. Bush looked at his watch, and that's the only thing people could remember. That was a Bill Clinton win because of a enforced error on the part of the president. And remember, we have some history with these two guys. They have debated a couple times, and arguably Donald Trump lost the first debate because he kept talking over Joe Biden. I mean, he went in loaded for bear. He was not going to give Biden a chance to speak. And Biden so famously said, shut up and let me finish my answer. And that became, there's nothing substantive about that, but it was like, wow, Joe Biden didn't fall asleep at the debate. This is good. And he actually pushed back on Donald Trump, who was kind of being a bully. So, I think you're right, Kailey. I think these have the opportunity to showcase the vitality of the candidates, but also their ability to sort of operate under the heat of those Klieg lights that are going to be on that studio in Atlanta. And I do think it's going to be that dynamic between the two of them, because I don't care what moderator you get. I'm sure CNN will post up some really good ones. They're going to lose control of this debate in the first 5 minutes, and then it's going to be mano a mano, and we'll see what happens then.
Picturing the weigh-in at some point here, Kailey. I feel like this is like pay-per-view stuff. Was this on purpose, Brad, to make sure RFK Jr. was not allowed on the stage? I know that he's not on the ballot in most states, but there's some polls showing him 15 to 20%. He could potentially qualify for an old-fashioned commission debate.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a roll of the dice with who RFK hurts and helps. A lot of his conspiracy-based theories on vaccines and et cetera, have traditionally have a home in the Trump orbit. His, last name is a home in the Democratic orbit, and there's not enough data to suggest. I mean, polling goes both ways on this. So, I don't know. I think, I agree with Rick. I thought he had a really good analysis of that. If you can't get to 270 because you're not on enough states, then you should not be in these debates. I agree with that. I think what's interesting here, though, is, if I were Trump, I'd be a little more careful of how he's approaching these debates, because right now he's setting the standard where Trump has very high expectations and Joe Biden has very low expectations. And so if Joe Biden doesn't literally fall asleep at the podium, he may have a win and may have won the expectations game, which is a big part of these debates as well.
That's right.
Rick, finally, I know we just had a whole conversation about how much of this is about performance over policy, but is a debate the best chance for Joe Biden to actually clarify what his policy in regard to Israel is, considering all the back and forth we have seen in the last few weeks?
Yeah, I think it certainly gives him a chance to talk directly to voters, and he has been sort of flip-flopping on this, which is all unforced errors on his part, right? I mean, like, he was fine with the approach he took. He decided to veer the other way. Republicans now are taking advantage of that, especially in the House of Representatives, forcing Democrats to take sticky votes on Israel. The bottom line is he needs to convince people that he's got a firm grasp of the economy, because nobody is going to decide this election on Israel, but it is going to be decided on the economy. And regardless of what the economic measures are today, especially with the CPI, he isn't getting that through to the American people. And if that's not the major topic of his conversation, he's cheating himself and his administration on the progress they've made, and he will not be able to get voters to start thinking differently about the economy.
All right, Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributor and Republican strategist, and Brad Howard of Corcoran Street Group. Thank you both so much.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
As we try to figure out next steps here for the Fed and exactly what is the state of our economy, knowing that the headline numbers don't always tell the whole story. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. It's good to have you with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. The euphoria on the street is one thing, Kailey, but it's a different consideration when you start talking to economists about where we are.
Yeah, especially if you're talking about economists who live over at the Federal Reserve,
Right.
who, yes, may be encouraged by this 1 month of data, but at the end of the day, this is just 1 month of data after 3 consecutive CPI prints that came in hot. It's great news to get one that was cooler than expected, but they're looking for a pattern here, not just a one-off, especially because they are haunted by the ghosts of decades past and do not want to risk cutting rates too early. So that is where we begin with Lindsay Owens. She is Groundwork Collaborative Executive Director, former Senior Economic Policy Advisor to Senator Elizabeth Warren. Lindsay, welcome back to Balance of Power. Obviously, you can see good things in the data today, but how many more data sets like this are we going to need to get before the Fed can feel comfortable cutting interest rates?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I mean, look, the print this morning was undeniably good news. Good news, I think, for American families, good news for the White House, and hopefully good news over at the Eccles building, where the chair of the Federal Reserve hangs out as well. Seeing core CPI come in at its lowest level since April of 2021, really 3 years now, when you sort of cleave off those food costs and those energy costs, that's just really, really great to see. And so, we'll see sort of how many more good prints the Federal Reserve Chair needs to see before he moves to rate cuts. But, hard to ask for much better than what we saw this morning.
So instead of trying to predict the Fed, Lindsay, what's your thought? Should we start cutting now?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you do not want to be behind the 8 ball on rate cuts. We've got a strong job market right now. We've got wages beating prices. And look, while the trend line hasn't been as sort of steadily downward as we'd like, overall, inflation has really been coming down off its peak for over a year and a half now. And so I think the line is moving in the right direction. Borrowing costs are really pinching families. We're really starting to see some negative impacts in the housing market where mortgage rates are sky high. So I'd really like to see a rate cut sooner rather than later, September at the latest.
Well, as you talk about what's happening in the housing market, it's worth pointing out that where we're still seeing the stickiness in inflation does include shelter prices. That has been pretty persistent over a number of data sets. So, Lindsay, what's the solution there? Are higher interest rates going to help solve that problem?
No, I'm quite the opposite, right? High interest rates lead to high mortgage rates, which keep folks in the rental market unable to come in to the single family housing market. And that keeps rent prices high. And that shows up in that shelter index, which, also there's some data issues there too, right? The shelter index really lags. And so it takes a little while for us to get relief on housing costs that show up in the CPI print. But if you're worried about housing costs in the United States, a high interest rate environment is certainly not going to get you in the right direction. It's not going to get Americans any relief in the housing market.
Spending time with Lindsay Owens from the Groundwork Collaborative. Lindsay, President Biden made a big splash yesterday announcing new tariffs on some Chinese imports, with some big increases on EVs, solar panels, some other things, semiconductors, while keeping all of the Trump tariffs in place. Is this the new normal now, this protectionist approach for Democrats and Republicans?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Tariffs used to be a four-letter word in both parties in Washington, really just a decade ago. And I think there's been a sea change in how folks on both sides of the aisle think about trade and think about what makes a strong and resilient American economy. I mean, I like to go back to the eve of the pandemic when I think Americans really got a glimpse of what it looks like to have an economy that is reliant on imports from China. And, what we saw when the pandemic hit is we couldn't make anything here. We couldn't make the COVID tests here. We couldn't keep PPE moving here. We had all sorts of shortages because of the supply chains being gummed up, coming in from Asia and China in particular. And I think Americans took a look around and said, look, a resilient economy, a strong economy is one in which we have a vibrant manufacturing class in America and is one in which we can sort of keep our own shelves stocked during a crisis. And so I think the Biden administration is making the exact right move when it comes to trade with China. If you want a green transition, a strong green transition, completely relying on cheap solar panels for China is going to get you in a heap of trouble.
Okay, so Lindsay, you think the Biden administration is making the right move here, but essentially the move that they have made is to stand by the decisions of the Trump administration when it comes to tariffs and, in fact, just go further in certain key sectors. When Trump first implemented these tariffs, when that trade war kicked off back in 2018, there was a lot of talk among economists about the detrimental effects that was going to have on the U.S. economy. It doesn't feel like we're hearing that as much this time around, and I just wonder why.
Look, I think the economics profession is evolving, albeit slowly on this point. But I think part of this is the story isn't just about trade deficits here, right? The story is about trade-offs, if you will. What are the things that we're trying to build a strong economy? One of the things we want is good jobs in America. If we make all of our EVs in China, we don't have a vibrant auto manufacturing industry in America. So that's an important piece of what we're trying to do with trade policy here. As I mentioned, we're looking for a green transition, but we're looking for a resilient green transition, one that isn't going to be at the whims of shifts in the Chinese economy, but that is durable in the United States economy too. And so I think when you look at the big picture, when you look at the suite of interests here, the American worker, what we want for American industrial policy, and what our foreign policy concerns are as well, it really points to the types of decisions that the Biden administration is rolling out based on really thorough reviews by the USTR's office.
Lindsay, it's great to have you back. Lindsay Owens, Groundwork Collaborative Executive Director. Her view on today's CPI data. Great to have you back. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.